Policy Talk seminar series. I'm Arjit Nandi, the interim director, and I'm going to introduce our moderator today, Nicholas King from the Biomedical Ethics Unit, also an associate member of the IHSP, as well as a member of the Department of Epidemiology and the Max School of Public Policy, where he's the director of the Policy and Data Science program, or PODS, which I've had the great fortune of being affiliated with for a couple of years now. So Nick, on to you to introduce our panel. Can't think of a better time to think about social policy and COVID comparing the US and Canada.
Awesome. Thanks, Harry. It is my job to introduce the panel for comparing social policy responses to COVID-19 in Canada and the United States. I imagine there are some salient differences. I can't think what they might be, but we're about to find out. We have three panelists joining us today. Daniel Beland is the James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada at McGill University. He will be speaking first. Shannon Dinan is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Bishop's University. Her research interests include comparative public policy and the welfare state. She will be speaking second. And Alex Waddan is an Associate Professor in American Politics in the School of History, Politics, and International Relations at the University of Leicester, UK. His research interests include investigating the politics surrounding social welfare policy and healthcare policy. All three speakers will be speaking sans slides. So if you can't see the slides, that's because there are no slides. And would ask that you hold questions until after they are finished speaking. So without further ado, please take it away, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks for the more generally for the invitation. We are really pleased to be here today. We are presenting a paper. I already put the URL in the chat box. It's a paper that just appeared last week in Social Policy and Administration, which is the oldest journal in the field of social policy research. And this paper is available. There is a paywall, but if you can't access the file, we can send you a PDF upon request. Just write to one of the authors later and we can send you a PDF. I want to say also that we only are 3 of the 4 co-authors today. Phil Rocco from Marquette University in Wisconsin is a co-author of the paper, but could not make it today because of his teaching obligations. So this paper is really about social policy responses to COVID-19 in Canada and the United States. This is not a public health paper. This is not a health policy paper. This is a paper focusing primarily on social protection and on policies enacted primarily at the federal level in Canada and the United States in response to the economic downturn triggered by the global pandemic. Okay, so as you all know, COVID-19 has hit North America and with a heavy toll in terms of lives lost and economic damage. And of course, in the paper, we do stress, we do provide some basic numbers about both the United States. Very important to understand that the nature of federalism affected the response to COVID-19 in both Canada and the United States. And that's really a central aspect of our paper. So the economic fallout of COVID-19 was immediate and stark. And we witnessed in both countries dramatic falls in GDP and also rapid increases in unemployment rates on both sides of the border. And we document that in the paper. This really rapid downturn is unprecedented, stronger than what we saw in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and stronger than what we saw in even the beginning of the Great Depression, and so in the late 1920s, early 1930s. So, of course, we have partly recovered since the spring, but it's still unprecedented in terms of the pace of this economic downturn. which is why in both countries, in both Canada and the United States, like in the other OECD countries, the other advanced industrial countries, a swift response took place, and policies were enacted to help the unemployed, to sustain the economy, to avoid a greater collapse of the economy. Of course, when you look at Canada and the United States, and you talk about social protection and supporting the unemployed and supporting people who are affected by economic downturns, when we talk about economic security, Canada and the United States are known as liberal welfare regimes. Okay, so they have a limited spending when you compare to other advanced industrial countries, especially countries in continental Europe and Scandinavia. So social spending in Canada in 2019 was only 17.3% of GDP and was slightly higher in the US at 18.7% of GDP. And that's below the OECD average, which is slightly above 20% of GDP. So despite the fact that they are both relatively low spending, liberal welfare regimes, Canada and the United States have, I would say, they feature differences in social policy architecture. For example, Canada relies much more on universal benefits. Actually, you don't have universal benefits, federal universal benefits, major federal universal benefits based on residency and or citizenship in the United States. But of course, in Canada, we have several major benefits like Medicare, but also old age security and so forth. So there are differences in terms of policy design between Canada and the United States. Another key difference relates to federalism, the fact that in the United States, the unemployment insurance system is decentralized. Each state has its own system, although the federal government does play a direct role, especially during economic downturns. In Canada, employment insurance is a purely federal program. You have regional variation through the EI regions, but it's more centralized system. And that's very important in terms of policy legacies. So what our article does is tries to explain why the scope and pace of policy change varied greatly between Canada and the United States during the first months of the COVID-19 crisis, as Canada enacted proportionally bolder emergency measures than the United States, while responding more rapidly to this pandemic than its southern neighbor. So in terms of social protection, clearly Canada, if we look at the federal level especially, acted more rapidly and more boldly than the United States. And in this article, we try to document this situation, and then we try to explain the differences, focusing on three main factors: existing policy legacies, political institutions, and the level of partisan polarization across the two countries. So more specifically, we attribute, in comparison to the United States, Canada's quick response to COVID-19 from a social protection perspective to distinct pre-existing social policy legacies, such as a more centralized employment insurance system, a parliamentary system with fewer institutional veto points, and a greater level of cross-partisan consensus about the crisis and the need to enact measures rapidly to support workers and businesses in a context of rapid economic downturn triggered by this global pandemic. So let's first talk about the social policy architecture, to use a term that Jane Jensen has popularized. So the existing policy legacies, the nature of social programs that existed in Canada and the United States before the crisis. So certainly the existence of a universal single payer healthcare system in Canada was a key difference. And the economic downturn that led to many people losing their health insurance coverage in the United States because many people, especially adults, workers, receive their health insurance through their employer. Of course, when you have a rapid increase in unemployment, you also witness an increase in the number of people who lose their health insurance coverage, which creates economic anxiety, okay? Not just health anxiety, but also economic anxiety. Another key difference I already mentioned earlier is the existence in Canada of a centralized federal EI system. Yet, what's important is that Ottawa did not expand the EI system. At first, what they did is they created specific programs, emergency programs, centralized federal programs to get money into the pockets of Canadians as soon as possible. Because Ottawa, the federal government, recognized the limitations of EI, but still there was this tradition in Canada, and we have been doing that since 1941, to have a federal centralized unemployment system. And this policy legacy, this precedent, really facilitated the enactment of these policies in Canada, while in the United States, as we'll see later, we witness much more decentralized policies because the unemployment insurance system in the US is run by the state. So later, Alex Waddan will tell us about what the federal government did to support the states, but in the end, huge variation at the subnational level in terms of the benefits that are offered to people, and that certainly made a difference and explains in part, so the higher degree of centralization in Canada in the field of unemployment benefits helps explain why Canada's response was faster and bolder than the US response in terms of increasing social protection for the unemployed in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the economic crisis it generated. Second, there is a greater power when we talk about, we shift from policy legacies here to talk about formal political institutions. There is a greater power concentration in Canada's parliamentary system that contributed to a fast federal response, faster than in the United States, where checks and balances tend to slow down the legislative process. And we see that right now. What's happening when we talk about enacting new measure, a new package to help workers and businesses in the US in this ongoing economic crisis and pandemic, we see that there is a stalemate, that nothing is happening. People criticize each other, the White House and Congress, Democrats in Congress, Republicans in Congress, but things are not moving forward. In Canada, despite the fact that we had a minority government, swift legislative action took place faster than the US, and also greater capacity to follow up rapidly with additional measures over time and updates, which is obviously not the case in the United States. I already mentioned the last factor, alluded to it when I talk about stalemate in US Congress and at the federal level more generally in the United States. Bipartisan consensus is lacking in the US. We see that right now in the aftermath of this presidential race, where Donald Trump still doesn't recognize his defeat. And this partisan polarization has existed in the US for several decades, but has become stronger and stronger over time. And the pandemic has not really affected it in a stronger way. While in Canada, we have seen much stronger consensus around science and around the need to address COVID-19 as a pandemic, but also greater consensus and greater coordination in terms of responding to the economic crisis it created. We saw that at the federal level in terms of collaboration within the minority parliament, but we also saw that at the subnational level in intergovernmental relations as well. We saw that despite existing conflicts between, say, Jason Kenney and Justin Trudeau, so Alberta and the federal government, or even Doug Ford, so Ontario and Justin Trudeau, that at least at the beginning of the pandemic, a great spirit of collaboration really dominated intergovernmental relations, and that also helped Canada moving forward. That was not the case in the United States, where Donald Trump will keep attacking democratic governors and where collaboration at the intergovernmental level remained more limited, in large part because of this important, this strong level of partisanship. So I just laid out what our three main arguments are about policy legacies, about formal political institutions, greater concentration of power in Canada at the federal level compared to the United States, and finally, partisanship. And now we'll pass the torch to Shannon. We'll talk more in detail about Canada and the measures that we enacted to illustrate what we have been talking about so far at a very abstract and general level. And then Alex will speak about the United States and also provide some concluding remarks. Thank you very much. Shannon, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So thank you very much for having me as well. So yes, I'll explain some of the specific social policy responses found in Canada. So if we begin with employment protection, you should know that in Canada, employment protection is a shared competence between both the provinces and the federal government. And so what we find is as the pandemic began to affect the economy, many provinces began by relaxing employment criteria. So the objective here was to, first and foremost, give more leeway to businesses if they need to let go of unnecessary staff, and also to defer any payments or credits for employment standards or worker compensation. We also found that temporary supports were created by the provinces, but these vary significantly since they're at the provincial level. If we look at the federal level, we find that the federal government presented larger initiatives with two main subsidies here. The first is the temporary 10% wage subsidy, and the second is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. So the former is meant to temporarily increase liquidity to enable businesses to reduce the amount of payroll deductions that they give to Revenue Canada, which is our tax collection and administration agency. And the latter is a much bigger initiative. It targets businesses by covering up to 75% of employees' salaries for up to 3 months. So this subsidy was initially only meant to be open until June 2020. However, it's been extended multiple times and eligibility criteria has been widened since then. In its most recent announcement on the issue, which was in October, the minority Liberal government has now proposed to run the subsidy until June 2021. And take up on the subsidy, however, has been lower than expected. So as of October 25th, there were nearly 1.5 million claims made. And this was for a total spending of $45.3 billion. But you should know that the initial budget for this policy, which was only supposed to run until June 2020, if you remember, that was actually $73 billion. If we turn then to unemployment protection, we find more ambitious and expensive benefits in Canada. So as Daniel already explained, Canada's policy framework includes different policy legacies, and unemployment protection in Canada, which is called employment insurance, it's a centralized federal program. And so employment insurance in Canada does have some well-known faults. This includes the inability to cover most workers. So research shows that a little under half of unemployed Canadians typically qualify for this benefit. And even workers who do qualify often experience difficulties when it comes to applying for the benefits they should be eligible for. So in a likely move to respond to these issues, the federal government created a temporary blanket policy in March for Canadians who lost employment due to the pandemic. So this is called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and it provided $2,000 for 4 weeks and could be renewed for a maximum of 28 weeks for eligible Canadians. Applications were also intentionally simplified by the government. So the objective here was to allow the most Canadians possible to access the benefit and speed up that access to funds, as Daniel alluded to. The policy was extended multiple times. It was finally phased out in early October, and a total of $81.6 billion was paid to Canadians as of October 4th, which are the most recent statistics I could find on this. You should also know that this is actually this is nearly 3.5 times the initial projected cost, which was $24 billion. So since then, the federal government has announced temporary changes to employment insurance. So the objective here is to increase benefit access. The government's also announced new recovery benefits, which should run until September 2021. And so the objective here is to move unemployed Canadians who are eligible for employment insurance to that program. And for those who are not eligible, they have 3 new benefit types that should come into place soon. The first is a benefit for unemployed Canadians, so who are unemployed due to the pandemic and do not qualify for employment insurance. The second benefit is for Canadians who have lost employment, including partial employment due to caretaking abilities. And then the third benefit is for workers who are either ill because of the virus or need to quarantine for the virus for 2 weeks. And benefit generosity is quite similar to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So in addition to these federal policies, We do find that Canadian governments have also, of course, modified other social policies. So this includes changes to social assistance and family policies. So in Canada, we find increased spending on various programs, including for Indigenous communities, women's shelters, homeless populations, food banks, youth, as well as some policies for low-income seniors. So once again, most of these initiatives are at the provincial level, as these responsibilities fall under their jurisdiction, and therefore they do vary considerably. However, the federal government has also made some changes. This would include, for example, one-time payments to low-income seniors and to families, which were made in the late spring. So of course, related to social policy is healthcare. And as Daniel mentioned, Canada's welfare state relies more on universal programs than our southern counterpart. And healthcare is universal in Canada, and it's managed by the provinces. You should also know that long-term care is also a provincial jurisdiction. So of course, people in long-term care are unfortunately more vulnerable to the virus, and they're particularly hard hit in Canada, especially in Ontario and Quebec, where the virus spread in these centers. The armed forces were eventually called in to help local workers on this issue. So vulnerabilities in long-term care facilities have persisted during the second wave of the crisis in Canada. So far, it doesn't appear to be to the same extent as the first wave, but of course, it's a progressing situation, so that'll be something that'll be watched carefully. In addition to this, while, as Daniel mentioned, intergovernmental relations in Canada have been quite strong during the pandemic, provincial governments have also made new demands for support from the federal government as of September, especially with regards to healthcare. So this includes, for example, unanimous demands by the premiers to increase cost sharing from 22% to 35% in healthcare. And should the federal government accept this, it would lead to an annual increase of $28 billion to the provinces and lead to a total cost of $70 billion a year. So as I just mentioned, of course, all these policies come at a cost. The provinces have been announcing deficits and new measures for some time, but I'll once again focus on the federal level here. So in July, the finance minister, who at the time was Bill Morneau, he provided a fiscal update. At that time, he announced a deficit of $343 billion and an overall estimated debt of $1.2 trillion in Canada. This number has very likely increased with the additional stimulus measures that have since been announced. And this debt is largely due to enormous fiscal stimulus by the federal government. A recent report by National Bank Financial also argues that this deficit will be approximately 20% of the country's economic output, and that no other developed country has provided as much fiscal support for the economic recovery as Canada. You should also know that the federal government has still not adopted a budget since March 2019. There was a 2020 budget tabled for March, but unfortunately it was not announced due to the pandemic. And so what this means is we're nearing a record for the longest period without a budget in Canadian history. If my calculations are right, that's 602 days as of today. And the current record holder is the Jean Chrétien government in the early 2000s with 651 days. So a lot of uncertainty persists on this issue. The new finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, she's expected to provide a second economic update sometime in the next month or so. And the government itself has promised to continue funding fiscal stimulus measures and will not create fiscal anchors until more certainty exists on the situation. So this may or may not be an issue. You should know that before this crisis, federal government debt stood at 31%, which is well below the G7 average. And initial projections have federal debt remaining below 50%. So the latest projections I was able to see was 49%, which still remains rather low for national averages. But a key area for concern in Canada is the fact that household and business debt is very high here when we compare them with other G7 nations. So what this means, of course, is that experts and forecasters are going to be continuing to keep an eye on this issue, and the federal government is probably still going to be continuing these programs to make sure that Canadian households and businesses have that liquidity that they need. So thank you very much. I'll let Alex continue.
Hello, everybody, and thanks very much indeed for the invitation to speak today. I'll build on what Daniel and Shannon have said, and more specifically talking about the situation in the United States, and just repeat in some ways some of Daniel's early points to bring things to a close. The response in the US is it's a tale of two halves in some ways. There was an immediate initial large-scale response. I'll talk about some of what that was, but more recently, as Daniel intimated, that's not been built upon, and some of the old fault lines in US politics have come back into view and prevented decisive action more recently. But as I said, initially there was an immediate response, and it was a bipartisan response in many ways. The major piece of legislation known as the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, a $2.2 trillion package was passed, 96-0 in Senate, and I've forgotten the exact figures in the House, but a handful of opposition in the House. So this was a big bipartisan piece of legislation. I'll flip. Shannon talked about employment protection before she talked about unemployment. I think in the US, I'll flip that, because in some ways the unemployment insurance was the bigger part of this package, or the more startling part in some ways from a US perspective. So part of the CARES Act was a major expansion of unemployment insurance in the US, and that expansion manifested itself in two different forms. First, there was an easing of eligibility to workers, including self-employed people, people working in the gig economy, lots of people who would not normally have been eligible, wouldn't normally have qualified for unemployment insurance at all. So there's an expansion of who was eligible. And on top of that, there was a huge boost to benefits from the federal government, $600 a week extra paid for by the federal government. So really quite a significant, massive boost to benefits. Now, going back to existing policy legacy, so while the federal government took this decisive action, the fact that these extra dollars were going to be distributed through the existing unemployment insurance scheme, the existing framework, meant that there were lots of delays in actually getting money into people's pockets. And that would be especially the case in states such as Florida, where there've been a series of policy initiatives at state level which were designed to make accessing unemployment insurance ever more difficult. In some way, ideologically driven moves to make sure that it was more difficult to access insurance, and then unemployment insurance, and then of course you get this sudden massive wave of people who trying to access these benefits, and it took a long time for the system to function properly. Moving on to issue about employment protection. Now, the emphasis on benefits losing the jobs in many ways contrasts with a lot of initiatives taken in other countries where the emphasis was on the efforts to keep people on payroll, particularly the case across Europe, actually, as well. But in the US, we did have something. There was the Payment Protection Program, which was this was a temporary emergency program which targeted small businesses, and small businesses could apply for loans that effectively became grants if they spent 75% of the loan on payroll, and that number was then reduced to 60% of the loan on payroll, so they could spend some of the money on utilities and rent and other things. So this was an effort to keep people on payroll, but it is subtly different from the types of schemes, the types of furlough schemes where the government is specifically paying a high percentage of people's salary or people's wages. So in that way, it was distinct from programs in other countries. In terms of paying monies directly to households, well, again, the policy legacy in the US meant there's a limited existing policy infrastructure to build on. There's no family allowance program, no child benefit program that could be expanded in a relatively straightforward manner. There was what seemed at the time a quite generous direct payment to families. This is back in March and April of $1,200 per adult and a $500 per child payment to all households that filed taxes in 2019. That was income tested, so that if it started tailing off at $75,000 and from $99,000 onwards, you didn't receive anything there. In addition to that, a number of states did use the flexibility in the SNAP program, better known as the food stamp program, to increase benefits and to ease administrative requirements, again, in terms of eligibility and in terms of staying on the program. The CARES Act also put in place emergency measures to protect renters. A sort of pre-existing housing crisis in many areas across the US was exacerbated by COVID and by the loss of income to many households. And so the CARES Act did put in place a temporary moratorium on eviction filings. And actually, when those protections ended, the Trump administration did issue an emergency order through the CDC, through the Centers for Disease Control, which barred most renters from being evicted through 2020. So in that context, the CARES Act shouldn't be underestimated as a relief package and as a stimulus package. It was a, you know, in terms of total cost, it was a huge cost. But the follow-up's certainly been limited. Many of the measures in the CARES Act came to an end in the summer. Now, the House Democrats did pass something called the HEROES Act, and I can't actually remember what the acronym stands for now, in May of this year, which would have extended and expanded many of the measures taken in the CARES Act, but that's not been taken up in Senate, where Republican members have sort of rediscovered their conservative mojo, so to speak. And in particular, they've worried that the expansion, the boost to unemployment insurance is too generous and provides a disincentive for people to go back into the labour market. So traditional conservative concerns about providing too much money to people who aren't in work, and they re-emerge over the summer of this year. Now, for its part, the Trump administration has sort of sent out various mixed messages. Just in terms of the negotiations about whether there should be a follow-up bill to the CARES Act, as you won't be surprised to know, I think you've had contradictory tweets from the president about what he does and doesn't want. One moment calling for a package and then denouncing Democrat efforts to develop packages. The negotiations from the White House have been led by the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, with minimal involvement from Trump himself. And to the extent that there would have been perhaps electoral advantage in actually getting a package passed before the election, there was pretty minimal effort to push Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell too hard to actually get something done. There was more of a blame game, really, between Republicans saying that the Democrats, the House Democrat packages were sort of too full of pork and unnecessary payouts, bailouts to blue states than actually providing needed relief, and Democrats in turn retorting that Republicans were just punishing those who were already suffering. One thing which the administration did do, actually, tried to find funds to extend some increase in unemployment insurance. So the Trump White House said that they would use funds from other sources to extend unemployment insurance for $300 per week for 6 weeks from the beginning of August, but that money has largely run out, and there are actually now only 8 states which are maintaining that level of increased unemployment benefits, unemployment insurance. There's a whole series of other parts of the CARES Act which end at the end of the calendar year, including the easing of eligibility for regular unemployment insurance. And at the moment, I assume negotiations may restart, but there's no package on the table to extend those measures in the CARES Act. So just quickly to reinforce the points that Daniel made at the start, these are 2 social welfare systems that are often seen as sort of being in the same family of welfare states. The welfare state literature will often place these in the same sort of liberal family, but clearly there have been important differences in the way that they've responded to this. The existing social policy extra in Canada was simply better able to withstand the crisis. I've not talked about healthcare in the US case, but that's the most obvious example of where the existing policy architecture in Canada, just people losing their jobs didn't affect their ability to access healthcare, and not just COVID-related care, but all healthcare. And again, there just weren't the array of programs in the US which you could simply expand, such as a childcare benefit. The institutional framework in the US, especially in a time of divided government, is not conducive to decisive action. As I say, the initial shock of the rupture, the economic rupture was caused by COVID, did force action in March and April, but the ideological equivalent of lockdown fatigue has kicked in for many conservatives in particular, and they've moved away from the idea that there should be any extensive government intervention. And sort of bringing together these 2 points, partisanship has kicked in again, and particularly in an election setting, I think much more so in the United States than is the case in the Canadian case. So I'll finish there and leave some time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Daniel, Shannon, and Alex. And we apologize for the Zoom bombing episode at the beginning. I think that's all under control. What we'll do now, given the situation, is I'd ask that anyone who has a question, please raise your virtual hand. or turn on your video and raise your real hand, and I will unmute you to give you the opportunity to ask the question. So the floor is open. And seeing no other questions, I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, which was sort of touched on, but I had kind of expected it. I'm not an expert in this field, but I kind of expected it more, and I wanted your reaction. What do you think the different kinds of approaches to federalism might have played in terms of the differential responses, both the formal way that federalism actually works and sort of the politics of federalism in both countries?
Thank you. Yes, thanks for the question. Before I start answering, and then I may let my colleagues talk about this, I want to also, if people maybe are shy, don't want to speak, they could probably write their question in the chat room, right? The chat box.
Yeah, we had turned it off. I think it is back on now. So yeah, if you want to write a question in the chat box, you can do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, regarding federalism, that's an interesting question. When we talk about, as I said earlier, when we talk about Canada and the United States, these are decentralized federations. If you compare to other federal countries like Germany or Australia, for example, Canada and the US, depending on what matrix you use, are more decentralized. But there are significant differences between these two countries. And I think there is important variation from policy area to policy area. Some policy areas in Canada are more decentralized than in the US, and some policy areas are more centralized. So in terms of healthcare, actually, Canada is more decentralized than the US when we talk about public benefits, because in the US they have Medicare, which is a purely federal, it's a federal program. But then they have Medicaid, which is decentralized and fragmented, but they still have Medicare, which is federal. While in Canada, when we talk about Medicare, we talk about the provinces and the territories, and the federal government plays a role in terms of financing through the Canada Health Transfer, and there's the Canada Health Act. But overall, it's a relatively limited role. But then on the flip side, you look at unemployment benefits, the system in Canada is more centralized because we have employment insurance, which is a purely federal program, and there is no equivalent in the US. And that's a decision that was made in the mid-1930s in the US when the Social Security Act was enacted in 1935 to just have a federal payroll tax for unemployment benefits, but let the states create their own systems on a voluntary basis in order to access this money. And the system has been working that way ever since. So these are important historical policy legacies, and I think that we have to understand these differences from a policy area to another, not just talk about federalism in general, but how federalism works in healthcare, how it works in unemployment benefits, how it works in other policy areas. Shannon or Alex, do you want to add something about this?
You first, Shannon.
Thank you very much, Nick. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. No, I would say I very much agree with what Daniel said. When it comes to employment insurance, our policy legacies simply favor us in this case. And so that's worked very well. And because we have a minority government with a specific ideology who favors government intervention, they were able to act swiftly when it comes to this. But as Daniel mentions, when it comes to healthcare, this is provincial, and there's cost sharing between governments through the Canada Health Transfer, but we can see that this might be an area for concern in the short term in Canada. So as I mentioned, we have premiers now saying, if the federal government is going to tell us what to do or how to behave, we need more money to back this up. So these calls were in September. They seem to have died down since then, or the premiers have not been exercising the full weight of their influence so far, but it might be something we could look out for. And we also have specific provinces with debts. I'm thinking of Alberta right now and announced cuts to healthcare. And so you might find more movement on this issue in the near future in Canada, but so far the policy legacies have very much worked out in our favor when it comes to that. I don't know if Alex has something you'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, Daniel and Shannon have covered the ground very well and clearly. I think just as Daniel said, in the US, Medicare, these terms get confusing. The federal program for seniors. The Medicaid program, though, one of the interesting aspects to that is are there different eligibility levels across states? And of course, one of the issues about Obamacare was the effort to expand the Medicaid program. Without getting into too much wonky details, the Supreme Court undermined the initial effort of the Affordable Care Act to make that a sort of national minimum of 138% of the federal poverty level. So a number of states, most states have now expanded Medicaid to cover all people below that level of income, but some states haven't. And clearly that had a differential impact in terms of those people who did lose their jobs as a consequence of COVID. Some would fall, so to speak, into a Medicaid and at least maintain some level of health insurance, and others would fall through those cracks and become uninsured. Just quickly, in terms of recent arguments about a new package, one of the issues which has really mired the negotiations has been the extent to which there will be federal government paying to how much money will be paid to states. And one of the protests of some Republicans is they don't want to see what they see as bailouts of Democratic-run, big D, Democratic-run states for fiscal deficits, which they would argue got nothing to do with the COVID crisis, but reflect long-term policy measures, in particular to do with pension schemes, which they run for state employees. So that's become one of the bones of contention in terms of getting a new package passed.
Great, thank you all. So we have one hand raised and then two questions in the chat. I'll go to the raised hand. Darius Ornston, and let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Alex, Daniel, and Shannon for sharing your research. This has been super interesting and helpful for me in terms of updating my knowledge on an area I don't know much about. I realize it's very early days, but I was wondering if you have any insights into the consequences of these different policy decisions that have been made. Do you see differences in terms of growth, unemployment, poverty, and whatnot between Canada and the United States?
I just want to start. Thank you very much. A few things. First of all, before I forget, this article will be part of a special issue that's still in progress of Social Policy and Administration, and I just want to acknowledge the co-editors, so Bea Cantillon, Almicar Moreira, Rod Hick, Peter Whiteford, and I. So we're editing the special issue. So we'll have articles about many other countries. European countries, Asian countries, and so forth. So that's just one part of the special issue, which is still a work in progress. Regarding your question, I think it's too early to tell, but we have already started to, our next project is actually to write about COVID-19, social protection, and inequalities in Canada and the United States, for another special issue, this time of policy and society, where we'll look more closely at the numbers. I think it's too early to tell. I do think that because the Canadian effort was bolder, we can expect a more direct impact in terms of income security, in terms of poverty reduction, especially because in Canada, and in the US too, but less generous way, flat benefits, right? So if you say give you $2,000 a month, that will actually proportionally be a better deal for low-income workers, right? So there are a lot of issues we can explore here regarding the relationship between policy design and inequalities in the context of this global pandemic and economic crisis. So I think that's an issue we'll tackle in our article. We'll look at the numbers as they become available. I don't think that we have the full picture yet. It's a bit too early to tell. As you know, it takes years sometimes to really evaluate the effect of a policy. So we have not looked at that in the context of this paper, but our next paper, which we have to submit to the journal in June of 2021, I hope by then we'll have a clearer picture. But my assumption is that the measures in Canada, because they were bolder, are likely to have a stronger impact on poverty, and on economic growth. But again, we will have to look at the numbers as they become available. But our article focuses really on policy decisions and policy design rather than policy outcomes. But this is the next thing we want to tackle. I'm sure others will do as well. That's why we have this. We plan this special issue, this next special issue. But I hope that Shannon, perhaps followed by Alex, want to say a few things about this.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time unmuting myself. Well, I have to say, I have to echo your sentiment, Daniel. I think it's too early to tell. I'm very curious, though, once we finally get our hands on some facts and figures to look through it. I will say, though, if we do compare the two cases, in Canada, you do see a conscious effort from the government to shift this debt burden that exists from the individuals and businesses to the federal government. Now, at the federal level, this is very clear. At the provincial level, this is less clear, and the provinces have been less marked in their decision to spend. And because of the debt burden in these provinces, some of them are actually cutting or trying to cut spending right now. So we're going to find it's very asymmetrical in Canada, but I do think that we have this broader Canadian-American comparison. That's my expectation. Unfortunately, can't get any more into detail until we get some numbers, but maybe Alex has something you'd like to add.
Well, only to repeat again that it's a really important question that we'll see over time, and I think it goes back to the issue of immediate responses when there was an understanding that this was what was the scale of what was happening. But then, as people get back into more traditional perspectives and get more unwilling to carry on long-term policy responses that cost so much money, so I think it's going to be really important to track this and to see what happens over time. But it's a crucial question. We just haven't got enough data, and of course, teasing out what's COVID-related issues and other other economic issues is something we'll have to try and do as well.
Great, thanks. We have 3 questions in the chat. I'll just read them out. The first, I guess, is directed mostly at Shannon. From Ari, can you say a bit more on public awareness of the social policy responses on the Canadian side? There were reports that the curb was imperfectly targeted, with many folks returning benefits. Also, news reports would suggest that the public is unaware of recently implemented sickness benefits, sick days through EI or the Canada recovery plans.
Yes, so I will say when it comes to these benefits on the Canadian side, they were specifically designed to be generous, right? So the federal government was very aware of criticisms of employment insurance. There's been talk for some time about how this policy could be reformed, which predates the coronavirus pandemic. And so they opted to go larger and then to, if necessary, claw back or make requests for payments to be returned. And so from everything we've seen, this was intentional on the government's part. When it comes to getting exact figures, I haven't found data, unless I'm mistaken, Daniel, that really gives us precise figures on what is and wasn't returned. Most of it's been through the media and hasn't been necessarily the sources we'd like to use. So the actual extent of the issue isn't well known, other than the government expected it and seems to be correcting it, but it's not their key concern right now. It's making sure that there's money in the pockets in Canadian households. When it comes to the new benefits, it's early days yet. We finally phased out the policy at the beginning of October, and people can still apply for the CERB retroactively for some time now. And so we're finding there's this shift from people moving who are on those special benefits into employment insurance, and we should probably expect delays and a bit of difficulty there because this program isn't perfect, and that's well known. And then people will be slowly but surely redirected to these other programs. And once again, access is rather broad. The programs are still very generous, so we might have this kind of in-between period where the public might be a little unaware, as we saw in the spring when the CRB was announced. But I also expect this to level out rather quickly because the government kind of seems to be aware of this. And we also have a minority government that's making these announcements with support from the New Democratic Party, which kind of facilitates their ability to continue spending in this case. So it'll probably level out soon, unless Daniel has another opinion.
No, I don't have any other opinion. Thank you. And I think we have other questions. We should probably take them before we're out of time.
Yeah, we do. We are ending at 1:30. So the next question from Mary Bartram: how have some of the policy factors that you've discussed, federalism, government structure, and so forth, impacted the COVID response on long-term care? Thinking here about a health and social care domain that falls outside of the Canada Health Act in the Canadian context, and not familiar with how policies are structured for LTC in the US.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I've published an article about this with Patrick Marier, and if you email me, I can send it to you on long-term care in Canada. Actually, I will put the URL down here for you. But meanwhile, I can tell you that in Canada, and I don't think it's really a big issue in the US right now, but in Canada, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but long-term care is at the center of the agenda right now because of the number of people who have died living in long-term care facilities, especially in provinces like Quebec and Ontario, the two largest provinces. So this has increased pressure from the premiers and provincial governments on Ottawa to spend more money, to allocate more money to the provinces in the area. I think that Shannon has already talked about some of these issues earlier. You know, the army was sent in some of these facilities in Ontario and Quebec. So dramatic situation that actually has reshaped the policy agenda and has moved long-term care at the top of the agenda in terms of healthcare in this country. Before that, pharmacare was probably the dominant issue on the agenda during the last federal election, for example. But right now, the agenda has shifted and the focus is really on long-term care and whether the federal government could impose so-called national standards or not in exchange for more money. And the provinces, especially Quebec, but other provinces as well, are pushing back against this statement by Prime Minister Trudeau, who wants to impose national standards in exchange for more money. So there is some debate. It's quite contentious, but it's likely that we'll see some movement in terms of long-term care reform at the provincial level, but we'll also see a lot of discussion about additional federal money and perhaps federal norms or attempts to steer the provinces in a certain direction over the next months. And so this is a big issue in Canada. And again, this article with Patrick Marier, I will put you the URL here. This is exactly what we say in the article. So I just basically summarize our argument about agenda setting here. Do you want to add something about the US, Alex, or Shannon, about Canada regarding this?
Well, only in terms of it's an issue which has clearly come into focus in terms of the number of people who've died who've been in long-term care. I mean, the US, like lots of places, doesn't have a particularly clear or effective policy towards long-term care, and it was one of the things, the first parts of the Affordable Care Act to bite the dust, actually, even before it in the planning stage, were the plans to have some sort of long-term care package as part of the Affordable Care Act. One of the interesting things I think actually is that lots of people, lots of the costs of long-term care, to the extent that it's borne by governments in the US, is on the Medicaid programs. People sort of exhaust their Medicare eligibility and benefits, then move on to Medicaid. And so a lot of families that wouldn't be traditionally regarded as low income will find that their elderly parents or whoever are actually receiving Medicaid benefits, which is one of the things which makes Medicaid a more popular program than you might imagine for a means-tested benefit in the US case.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. Frank Elgar asks, can the Canada-US differences in policy and the health impact of COVID-19 be extrapolated to other countries? Do you think there are broader social and economic factors that are driving both, thinking of economic inequality, for example?
Well, this is an issue that we'll tackle in the two special issues are mentioned. I think it will take a lot more time to actually answer this question. There are clearly factors here, broader institutional factors. I mean, many of the countries we study in these two special issues are not federal in nature. So federalism will not play a role in these countries, obviously, but other institutional factors are likely to condition the response to COVID-19. And I will emphasize here that based on what I've seen so far, existing policy legacies are very important in all countries. And so what they did before the pandemic doesn't just go away with the crisis. Countries build on what they've done in terms of their bureaucratic capacity, their the staffing, the people they have, the way their policies are organized to send help to people as rapidly as possible. So I think that we can certainly show this continuity, despite this crisis, this institutional continuity in terms of policy legacies across many different countries. But that's something you will have to wait to look at the special issue of social policy administration when it's out next year to have a systematic assessment of these differences and similarities among OECD countries.
Great. Well, we are at time. I want to thank our panelists, Danielle, Shannon, and Alex. I want to thank the IHSP for putting on this great panel, and also everyone who asked questions. This has been fascinating, and I, for one, have learned a ton. So thank you very much to everyone, and we'll see you at the next IHSP event. Ari, did you or Anaik want to announce what the next event is?
Sure, yeah, it's there in the chat. Next week, there's going to be a Policy Talk seminar, which is organized by the IHSP Disability Working Group, which is headed by Professor Baudry. So this is going to be given by Adi Goldner, thinking about workplace misconduct due to disability. So it's next week at the same time. Hope to see you there.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.